So good evening. It's a wonderful day to be in Kitchener-Waterloo, Ontario. And we're glad you're here. My name is Scott Klein. I'm the director of the lecture series and the Center for Responsible Citizenship. It's so good to see so many of you out on a Friday evening. It's so beautiful. We have a fairly full program tonight. I'm going to start off with a number of housekeeping matters, and I'm serious housekeeping matters. I believe somebody left a garage door opener at the donor reception. It's an overhead garage door opener. So if you think that you're missing one, let me know. See me after the lecture, and I'll give you your way back into your home. So, because I don't want to go there. The other thing is that we do have somebody who left their lights on. It's a gray Nissan, license plate number AVSC 579. So if that's you may want to go out and take care of that. I don't think the car is running, and I don't think it's locked, so at least it's just your lights, so it's, that's good. A number of other housekeeping matters. We have a number of tables out in the foyer tonight. One table in the very far back of the foyer is sponsored by the University Catholic Community, and they're selling fairly traded coffee and chocolate, so please, if you're interested in purchasing some of that, see them on the way out. Also, we have a group of students in the Beyond Borders program at St. Jerome's University. The Beyond Borders program is St. Jerome's international experiential learning program. Students interested in doing works of social justice will get involved in this program. They'll go away for 3 months. It's a wonderful program. The students are wonderful. If you want to chat them up, they're more than happy to do that. They're also taking money, of course. Students in need. They'll be going to places like Peru, Uganda, Ukraine, and a number of other places around the world doing absolutely incredible work. They've been preparing for these trips and for the work since September. So they'll go away for 3 months, and when they come back, there'll be a debriefing and public engagement, and it's a way of building social justice community here at St. Jerome's. It's an absolutely wonderful program. Other matters of housekeeping, in case I forget at the end of the lecture, we have one more lecture in the lecture series this year. It's going to take place on April 7th. It's a Wednesday, and this is the 2009-2010 Sweeney Lecture. In current issues in healthcare. And the title of that lecture, it's actually a panel, Aging at Home, a panel discussion on the challenge of a generation. That lecture, that panel will not take place here. It will take place at St. Mary's General Hospital. So if many of you are regular attendees at these lectures, do not come here on Wednesday, April 7th, but instead go to St. Mary's General Hospital on Queen Street. Remarkably, it's 911. Queen Street, so you call 911 and you go to the hospital. I don't know something about that, but anyway, it will take place there. There's a special hall that they've inaugurated last year, and you're welcome. Parking is free, so that's one advantage. If you say that you're there for the lecture, you get free parking that night. So make your way. Again, it's Wednesday, April 7th at 7 o'clock, the John Sweeney Lecture in Current Issues in Healthcare. Okay. So tonight is the 2009-2010 Somerville Lecture. This lecture is sponsored by the Catholic Register. It's the oldest, I believe, paper in Canada, Catholic paper, and it covers current events and has articles that are engaged in public policy issues relating to international affairs, but also local issues. The editor of the Register is here tonight, Mr. Jim O'Leary. Jim is in the back here, so welcome, Jim. Yeah, the Somerville Lecture is actually named after Henry Somerville, who was the longest, who had that position of editor for the longest of anybody. This lecture started under the editorship of Joe Sinistak, who has since moved on to Novalis, and we very much love this lecture. We've had a number of good lectures, and I know that tonight's lecture will carry on that wonderful tradition, won't you, Joe? You will, of course. So to tonight's speaker, a wonderful friend, a wonderful human being. Joe Gunn is a native of Toronto, Ontario, and a product of the Ontario Catholic school system. He holds a bachelor's degree in political science from the University of Toronto. He earned a master's degree from the University of Regina in political science. Throughout his adult life, Joe has been active in social initiatives in Canada and abroad. At the age of 21, and still not yet finished with his undergraduate degree, Joe took a position running a social justice office in Saskatchewan. Later, Joe moved to Latin America, where he worked in refugee camps and served as a country director for the Canadians Save the Children. It was in Nicaragua where he met his wife, Suzanne. A few years later, Joe took a position with the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops, where he developed policy and coordinated work in the areas of social justice, missions, Aboriginal peoples. He held that position for 10 years. Joe is, and I'm trying to be understated here, a mover and a shaker. I think he would probably use the term pusher, I think is what he is. I think that's fair. He served as the founding vice chair of KAIROS, the Canadian Ecumenical Justice Initiatives, and he has been active in the Canadian Council of Churches Commission for Justice and Peace and the Ecumenical Healthcare Initiative. Joe has coordinated the Make Poverty History campaign and engaged in research, public speaking, and advocacy on national and international issues. In August 2008, Joe became the executive director of the Citizens for Public Justice, where he is spearheading a campaign to combat poverty in Canada. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Joe Gunn to the podium.
Good evening. Well, I'd like to set the stage for you. Think back to 1996. And to be a little more exact, think back to October 17th, 1996. It's become for me a day I won't forget. It's like a holy day of obligation. It's a day when you make a pilgrimage, especially if you live in Ottawa, up to Parliament Hill. Because October 17th is the International Day for the Eradication of Poverty, according to the UN. But in 1996, October 17th was perhaps even more interesting. Canadians turned on their evening newscast that night, and they heard the anchor, Peter Mansbridge, who had almost as much hair as I do then. Peter Mansbridge began with these words. He said, "Good evening. A blistering attack on governments across the country today from Canada's Roman Catholic bishops. The issue is poverty. The bishops accuse governments of using the most vulnerable people in society as human fodder in the battle against deficits. And the bishops weren't the only ones speaking out." Now, I was just beginning my second year of work with the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops. I was in their social affairs office. And the bishops were holding their annual plenary meeting in Halifax, Nova Scotia that year. But before we began the meeting, however, the bishops of the Social Affairs Commission gathered with a room full of local people, including a woman by the name of Pam Coates, whom I remember well. She's a good United Church woman. And Pam was the president of the National Anti-Poverty Organization. And there, before the assembled media, the bishops released their pastoral letter on poverty issues called "The Struggle Against Poverty, a Sign of Hope for Our Time." Working against poverty was a sign of hope for our time. And they did it at Hope Cottage. This was released at Hope Cottage, which was a church-based soup kitchen in the downtown core. People living in poverty got to speak, so it wasn't only the bishops who got the microphone. Pam Coates and local spokespeople were totally involved in delivering that message. And after the press conference, the media accompanied the men in black down the street to serve lunch and to eat together in the soup kitchen. In other words, the plan of the commission, the plan of the bishops, was the content of their message as well as the symbolic manner in which it was to be delivered would encourage serious consideration of the issues they wanted to communicate. And so that night the CBC newscast went on and it said, in Canada, more than 5 million people are poor. More than 1 million of them are children. The Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops, said Peter Mansbridge, issued a sharp attack against government policies it says hurt Canada's poor, especially the children. And the bishops quote a report from church groups, which said, in our society, if a parent denies a child food, clothing, and social security, it's considered child abuse. But when our government denies 1,362,000 children the same, it's simply called balancing the budget. That caused a bit of a stir. And given that there was little coverage in French media in a place like Halifax, 2 weeks later the bishops went to Montreal. And they went to a place, a soup kitchen called Chic Resto Pop. I remember it very well. It wasn't very chic. And there they echoed the criticism of the Quebec bishops, who were very worried that then Premier Lucien Bouchard had decided that his government would achieve a budget with a zero deficit. The bishops, on the other hand, were interested in zero poverty. Bouchard, of course, was only mimicking the 1995 budget, now famous, of Finance Minister Paul Martin, which was designed, as you may recall, through hell or high water, as he said, to wipe out the deficit. And the bishops went on to do follow-up, not only in Montreal there, but they held a conference a couple of years later with members of the National Anti-Poverty Organization there by issuing yet another statement on poverty 2 years later in order to update all of us and to tell us of their ongoing concerns. Now, this wasn't the most newsworthy of all of the different letters that the Canadian bishops have released over the years. It was one that I was kind of personally involved with. There were others that we could talk about. But I think the more important kind of reflection for this evening is just to ask ourselves, do you think that this public engagement of church leadership had an impact? Did it make a difference in your life? Have any of these statements made a difference in your life? And in my case, it really did. Because, as Scott mentioned, my first full-time job, 21 years of age, was going off to the prairies and setting up a social justice office in a diocese. And there we'd go driving across the frozen prairie in the middle of winter. Sometimes I was wrapped in a sleeping bag inside my old Dodge Dart to keep warm, I remember. But we'd take these Labor Day statements of the bishops, or at that time there were ecumenical letters that came from many church leaders in different denominations, and we'd organize meetings where people could discuss these, and folks would drive in for a couple of hours from Crake and Central Butte and Esterhazy and Estevan and Gravelbourg and have really animated conversations about these documents. So back to 1996, when I was with the bishops, not only did the Catholic press print the statement so that people could read it, the entire text, but this was also the first year that the statement was put up on the brand new website of the Catholic bishops. All fine and good. But imagine my surprise a couple of years ago. I went into the website of the bishops, and the statement is nowhere to be found. Someone had decided to take it down. So luckily, if you go into the website today, cccb.ca, you'd actually find the statement there. But the Social Affairs Commission of the Bishops seems to have only issued 5 statements on social justice in the last 5 years, according to their website. And only one document, which is a pretty good letter to the Prime Minister about the possibility of trafficking, sex trafficking in Vancouver at the time of the Olympics. There's only one document that's available on the website since March of 2008. So that seems to be a pretty big change from a time when this particular church seemed to be much more vocal. I wonder if we spent some time thinking about it. It's not as if the church has been totally silent. If you think for a moment, if you asked some of your neighbors, any of your neighbors, what issues the Catholic Church has public opinion on, you're likely to hear that people know where the church stands on things like same-sex marriage and abortion, I would imagine. But if you asked if any of your neighbors have heard any of the church leaders speaking about how the poor have been affected by the recent economic downturn, they could be forgiven, even though some of the church leaders have, I must say. But I think probably they could be forgiven for not knowing, and maybe we haven't heard any of those either. The organization where I work, Citizens for Public Justice, there's some paper about it in the back, and Scott mentioned where we've got a anti-poverty campaign going now. There's some things you can pick up about it. We're going to release a study this next month that actually shows how poverty has increased in Canada over this last recession. You would expect that. We're going to try and crunch some of the numbers for the public. But the issue is, why is this happening? How are we to understand this change? How are we to understand that less of a public voice is happening in probably all of the churches? And maybe bring ourselves to ask, is there still a role for conscientious Christian leadership and public justice in Canadian society today? And then further, if there is such a role, how should it best be done? So the title of this lecture is called Muted and Maligned Voices, Public Justice in the Canadian Churches. And as someone who has worked in a diocese, or I've worked for a couple of religious orders, and I've worked at the National Conference of Bishops, I come to this discussion with a lot of biases. But I really want to thank the organizers here at St. Jerome's, as well as in the Catholic Register, for giving me the opportunity to do a little bit of reflection on what have been more than jobs for me. This work has been a happy calling, and it's been really my vocation. It's been a labor that's made a lot of my life's work worthwhile. And I'm really honored to be actually asked to participate in a lecture that's named after Henry Somerville, this editor of the Catholic Register, who must have been really quite an exceptional fellow. Imagine someone at the age of 17, living in Britain at the time, who joined the Independent Labour Party and then later that year founded something called the Catholic Socialist Society. He must have been an interesting guy. The local bishop got wind of this, condemned the group from the pulpit, and in a pastoral letter. So young Somerville accepted this rebuke, and even though he's apparently a little bit hurt by the bishop's zeal, he resigned from both of those groups. But he went on to believe that the church's message wasn't mutually exclusive from care for the poor and the love of God. Joe Sinistak, who wrote a book about Henry Somerville, says that Somerville was quoted as saying that, he really believed that if people would go and study the social thought of their church, they might be able to come to see that, and I quote, "It may not be possible to banish all suffering from the world, but it would be practicable to get rid of social as distinct from individual injustice." And Henry Somerville must have been quite a fellow. So, in any case, public justice and the role of the churches is not a new topic, of course. I hope to tantalize you with a few ideas this evening about some changes. What I don't want to do is moan and groan about some kind of idyllic past that never really existed, a time when churches and Christians were known for doing wonderful things that we could never hope to emulate today. I think we can emulate a number of wonderful things that were done in the past, but we can also move forward. It is much more useful, I think, to offer some hopeful possibilities. It's a tough job to be a church leader at a time like today, and that those that I've met are wonderful, wonderful people. A lot of my life has been to how to encourage and enable them to be able to play the roles that they see that they want to play. And I think our world is certainly in need of ways to strengthen these heartfelt efforts that many of us would have about freedom, social change, and religious renewal even. And maybe the first question in this whole dialogue is whether the churches should be involved and Christians should be involved in the public sphere to begin with. Because in our society today, especially for people outside the churches, it's a bit of a question. Some people think that the churches, if they haven't behaved well with recent sexual abuse scandals or other failings of leadership, that indeed the churches should simply be quiet. In the United States of America, you have a situation whereby there's a celebrated role of separation between church and state. But we know that's not the case in Canada. Here, the beginning sentence of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms boldly states that Canada is founded upon principles that recognize the supremacy of God. And in Section 2, it says the fundamental freedoms of conscience, religion, thought, belief, opinion, and expression are guaranteed and subject only to such reasonable limits prescribed by law as can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. That's in Section 1. So society will rightly debate and should debate what those reasonable limits prescribed by law might be. So we should have debates about the legal definition of marriage or public funding of schools or end-of-life issues and all kinds of other things. It's very legitimate. But what is also true is that to ask a person of faith to leave their beliefs behind as soon as a political discussion begins, that's like asking a lung to refuse to breathe in air. Where I work at Citizens for Public Justice, we've long worked on those kinds of issues, and CPJ believes that if we understand religion as those things that are our ultimate commitments or our life convictions, then it can't be confined in any way to private life or particular rituals or certain institutions. And there's no reason we would think why we could argue for keeping Christianity or Islam or any other belief out of public life when indeed there are other religious value systems, if you will, like capitalism or liberalism or humanism or whatever other ism that aren't restricted. So CPJ would see merit in guarding the freedom of religion and rejecting attempts to impose freedom from religion. The real issue, it seems to me, is how people of faith can and should contribute to a hopeful citizenship. Now, there's another kind of question for people maybe that are inside the churches. And that is really whether public justice work is legitimate activity for church people or whether it's simply a distraction or worse. And I could go on and make the point that authentic Christian holiness means getting involved in the work to defend the poor or other people, to work for justice, to protect the environment. I could cite biblical quotations from the Old Testament prophets or the New Testament, Jesus and the letter of James and these kinds of things. I could quote papal documents for Catholics or neo-Calvinist writings for our Reformed friends or social gospel speeches from prominent Canadians like Tommy Douglas, or I could even quote some ecumenical statements from church leaders from different persuasions over the last 30 or 40 years. But I'll spare you that. And indulge me, though, to just mention for one moment a quote from one of my own heroes. I'm doing that to make the same point, but to say that because I lived in Latin America for 7 years, where this person is considered a saint, in 5 days we're going to celebrate a real landmark moment, the 30th anniversary since this person was killed while celebrating Mass. And this person said, 30 years ago, more than 30 years ago, the church would betray its own love for God and its fidelity to the gospel if it stopped being a defender of the rights of the poor and a humanizer of every legitimate struggle to achieve a more just society that prepares the way for the true reign of God in heaven. And also, when the church hears the cry of the oppressed, it cannot but denounce the social structures that give rise to and perpetuate the misery from which the cry arises. So Archbishop Romero of El Salvador then believed that not only did Christians have to get involved in public justice, but that the proper way to advance on this path to holiness is actually to address the causes of suffering of the poor and the disadvantaged. So where are we today? What's the status of faith-based work for social justice today? Maybe the answer to this question is a little complex. In the United States, if you read Sojourners magazine, an evangelical magazine edited by the famous Jim Wallis, he wrote a book, actually in 2008 it was published, called The Great Awakening, and he talks about the post-religious right America. Wallis was writing at the time when there was a lot of buzz about Obama becoming the president, if you will. This was before his current struggles and troubles and the Tea Party movement and all these kinds of things. But he really felt that because so many of the religious right folks had aligned their political hopes so closely to President Bush, that this was turning around, and that because Mr. Bush was so heavily disliked, that the religious right wouldn't have the same impact on religious discourse in the United States. Time magazine referred to this as a leveling of the praying field. But what about Canada? We could debate whether this Mr. Wallis was right or Reverend Wallis was right in the United States or not, but what about Canada? Well, my predecessor at the Catholic Bishop's Office, Tony Clark, wrote a book in 1995 called Behind the Mitre, in which he suggested there was a moral leadership crisis among Canada's Catholic bishops, causing them to moderate their progressive leanings and their public pronouncements. And another fellow who's working today, Bob McKean in Edmonton, as the social justice fellow in the Archdiocese there, has done his thesis, which suggests that there was a progressive paradigm evident in the Catholic Church leadership after Vatican II, but it really ran out of steam by the time you got into the early 90s. And other authors have described similar trends in other Christian denominations across the country. In some ways, we shouldn't be too surprised by this. If we think back to what was going on in the world in general at the time, there was a kind of a move, certainly in the Western world, to more conservative philosophies. You could see the fall of the Berlin Wall. It was a wonderful advancement, I think, for society, but the kind of utopian hope of some that socialism would be somewhat different, this was certainly ended, I think. In Central America, where I lived, a number of the liberation struggles petered out. In the 90s, the Sandinista government was voted out of power in 1990 itself. And there were some assaults by church leadership in many Christian persuasions on liberation theologies. So maybe there was a time when we were becoming much less pointed on social issues. Let me say, though, these were the years when I started to work in the Bishops' Conference, the mid-90s, and if I thought that these folks were totally correct in that there was nothing to be done, I'd be probably a nutcase for taking on a job like that. But all of our colleagues in the ecumenical movements did this work not because we didn't realize that some of the fervor of the earlier decades had perhaps waned, but rather we had enough energy and we had enough hope that public justice work would move forward because it really was a sign of the Spirit working through the churches. We believe that to be Christian mandated us to try and advance the agenda whether it was particularly well accepted or not. And if we fast forward to today, I think this capacity and determination of the churches to work for social and ecological justice may seem weak, but it also is a time to call us to move forward. Maybe the churches are a little too concerned about a shrinking membership and maintenance of structures that were in other decades much larger. And that may be a difficulty. Maybe that gets us a little bit off track. If you read the Globe and Mail article last month, you would have seen the title of the Anglican Church, for example, going extinct. An article that said that Anglicans in Canada are losing 13,000 members a year, and by the wonderful calculations of the Globe and Mail, so it must be true, by 2061, if this trend continued, there would be only one Anglican left in Canada. I know there are some Anglicans here in the church, so don't feel badly. I don't think it's not going to happen. But I think it is true that a number of the larger Christian denominations are losing members. In the Catholic Church, of course, that would be the Catholic Church is growing, but only because of recent immigration of new people. Well, what happened in the social justice scene was, again, a bit of a decrease, you'd say. In 2008, some folks in this room and myself were involved in a program of the Canadian Council of Churches that's now been closed. It was called the Ecumenical Healthcare Network. We had a lovely evening in this very hall a number of years ago with Roy Romano after he did his Royal Commission report on healthcare. Some of you may have been here. But anyway, this work is no longer able to continue because the churches stopped sending representatives to the committee to study healthcare issues in Canada. But I can remember times when we would have sessions on Parliament Hill with 100 people there, lots of MPs and so on, bishops, representatives of churches, and everybody would be there discussing healthcare issues. It's kind of a shame that the churches now don't work together on an issue as important as healthcare. And then we have the ecumenical social justice history. Many of you know that since the 70s, the Christian churches worked together in different ecumenical social justice coalitions. Some of you were probably involved in some of them. Since 2001, we amalgamated the groups and called this organization KAIROS. And you've heard it's been in the news recently, I'm sure. Midway through last year, KAIROS, because of lack of donations from the churches and rising costs and so on and so forth, had to let 4 of their 27 staff go. And they stopped working on issues as important as refugees, international trade, debt, and corporate accountability. The anti-poverty program of the churches, which we used to call Plura. You know what Plura meant when we set it up in the 70s? Presbyterian, Lutheran, United, Roman Catholic, and Anglican. It's a very creative name. Very creative. Anyway, Plura ended after more than 30 some odd years of work. And you may have heard as of last November, December, that the federal government has decided now to cancel the international funding that was going to KAIROS. So you get the impression that that's been a difficult time for those involved in the ecumenical community concerned with social justice and ecology issues. But are these two events that I've just mentioned in healthcare and in KAIROS, are these kind of isolated events, or is it part of a bigger trend, and how would we know? I wanted to try and see if it was a bit of a trend that could be talked about with some seriousness, or whether these were isolated moments. And so about a month ago, I decided that I would try and ask the people that were directly involved. Perhaps if you asked the church leaders, they would say we're still committed to all these kinds of things. But what would the people say that were actually involved in the work? So I talked to the representatives of 9 different churches or church organizations that are working on social justice or ecological justice work. And I asked them if they'd agree to answer a few questions. So I sent a questionnaire around, and 8 of the 9 were more than willing to do so. I'll leave you to guess who might not have responded to my questionnaire. But after, a little bit of cajoling and so on, 8 of 9 responded. And so I heard from the Presbyterian Church in Canada, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada, the Anglican Church in Canada, the United Church of Canada, the Christian Reformed Church, the Mennonite Central Committee Office in Ottawa, the Canadian Religious Conference, which is a grouping of all the sisters, priests, and brothers in Catholic religious life in Canada, and the Canadian Council of Churches. The Canadian Council of Churches isn't a church, but 18 groups working together on social justice issues through the Commission for Justice and Peace. So I thought that would be a representative sample. What did they say? What did they say? What did we learn? It's not a scientific survey, but what does this snapshot tell us? I asked them, how many staff in your churches are charged with social justice roles today? And then I asked them to let me know how many staff were charged with that responsibility 5 years ago. Well, among the 9 churches that answered the survey, or this question, over 2/3 had fewer staff resources to count on today. 2 of the smaller churches, the Mennonite and the Christian Reformed, had increased, actually. But both those increases were less than a half-time position for that work. Several of the organizations actually mentioned that they now use more short-term contracts, they use internships, they get students to do work, and this kind of thing. And a number of the churches no longer send staff people to various committees that the church used to staff, but now they send volunteers, which is good, but then you have a whole different type of work. One respondent expressed disappointment that he said there were few, if any, justice educational resources for use in congregations, and this person expressed disappointment that there is no longer capacity to draft briefs or make presentations to government committees. Now this, in some way, echoed my own experience when I worked in the bishop's office. When I went to work in 1994 there were 4 full-time positions in the social affairs office. When I was leaving, or the year before I was leaving in 2004, I was asked to take on the social affairs, and I agreed, the social affairs office work, the Commission for Reconciliation with Aboriginal People, which had a $250,000 budget for projects across the country, and the missions office, which had a $250,000 budget for projects all around the world. And we had 3 staff to do all that work, usually done by 6 people. I asked these church groups another series of questions about budgets. What did your budget look like now? What does it look like 5 years ago? And 5 groups reported that they suffered some decreases. Some of the churches even and their offices had up to half of the money now that they would have had 5 years ago. 2 of the churches had no increase, and the 2 smaller churches that were planning to increase staff had logically been able to maintain or somewhat increase their budgets, actually. So if you assume that those that even maintained the budget while inflation was going up were still under some pretty good constraints, what it means is that 7 of the 9 largest Christian churches in the country have less resources going to this work than even 5 years ago. I asked folks about future expectations. 6 of the 8 churches responded to this question. They expect decreased budgets in the very short-term future. Some of the churches were saying next year we're going to be cut 9%, we're going to be cut 10%, and that means they're probably going to lose staff. One church office decided to give staff a week off without pay as a cost-saving measure. The 2 groups that were adding staff, of course, expect stability over the next period. But then I asked the most difficult question. This was the last one. Do you feel that your church office has increased, decreased, or enhanced effectiveness in social justice ministries over the past 5 years? This is difficult to mention, but at least we get a sense of what the people who are involved in the day-to-day work think. So 7 of these groups answered, with the 2 smaller churches expressing the view that they have or soon will increase their effectiveness, which is positive. 3 of the churches mentioned greatly decreased effectiveness, they thought. And here I'll just give a few of the quotes of the comments that I got. One respondent felt that his church had, quote, in practice, essentially abandoned its work on social justice, unquote, spending most of its time on internal issues and sexuality, which he spelt in capital letters. This person added, I suspect that those who are passionate about working on these issues are now outside formal church structures. Another comment, which was actually echoed by two of the respondents, was very revealing as well. They said, the application of the Lund principle. The Lund principle is something that came from the World Council of Churches, I believe. It's basically the idea, well, this explains it. The application of the Lund principle has weakened in recent years. The idea that churches should act together in all matters except those in which deep differences of conviction compel them to act separately. In other words, let's work together wherever we can. But that's been weakened, they said. Both collaboration and coordination among the churches need to be strengthened, they said. And the last revealing commentary, I'll quote as well. Someone said, with the sequential decimations of church office staff in all the important member churches of the Canadian Council of Churches, there's nothing like the capacity there used to be to undertake substantial work compared to 5 years ago. We continue to rely on sister organizations for substantial policy work, groups like Project Plowshares, folks that are here tonight, thankfully, Citizens for Public Justice, where I work, KAIROS. And then another commentary ended, unfortunately, those partners are also vulnerable, and perhaps none as vulnerable as in the case of KAIROS. As I mentioned, if you've been in the news, you've probably read about this, how the government has cut the international funding for KAIROS. What has been discussed less is really the question of whether the churches who are members of KAIROS and sit on the board still have that same commitment to do public justice work together. I'm going to speak, since this is a Catholic college, especially to the Catholics about this right now, because the financial commitment of both Development and Peace, the aid agency of the Catholic Church, and the Conference of Bishops has really diminished over these last years. In 2004, the Catholic bishops cut their entire contribution of over $55,000 to KAIROS. Since then, they spend not a cent of their own money on this work. What happens from the Catholic bishops is that they receive grants from Development and Peace, the aid agency, and they pass those on. They pass on the full amount to KAIROS. When I mentioned this in a weekly column that I write for a monthly column for a Catholic paper in Western Canada, the General Secretary of the Bishops' Conference wrote a letter to the editor to set the record straight. And while he didn't take issue with any of my assertions, my former boss mentioned that the bishops were being very generous by passing on the $100,000 that they get from Development and Peace directly to KAIROS, because, of course, they could decide to keep some of that money for their own purposes and run their own office. I don't contest the fact that $100,000 is generous. But it is also true that 6 years ago, when I worked at the Bishops' Conference, that same generous donation was over $250,000. That wasn't mentioned in the letter. But really what the situation is that we have the faithful and generous contributions from religious orders on the Catholic side, religious sisters, brothers, priests. Those are the folks that are maintaining the Catholic contribution, and lay people that give their donations. These are the people that are maintaining the Ecumenical Social Justice Ministry today. Well, a week after CEDA's cuts to KAIROS were announced, Development and Peace actually posted a letter on its website. They wrote to the government to ask them to reconsider the initiative, but the Catholic bishops didn't. They were quiet. So I tried to interview them and called over and tried to see what was happening. I was told that actually at the end of November, 2 days before the government decision came down, the bishops wrote a letter, the president of the bishops wrote a letter to the CEDA minister asking for these funds to be approved. And then it was announced that they would not. The executive of the bishops met in early December, and they unanimously agreed that they will not embark on a campaign to pressure the government of Canada to reconsider its funding decision. The bishops actually have a seat on that board, but they weren't going to work with the other churches to complain about that funding cut. So what did this memo say that went out to all the bishops? It gave two reasons for their inaction. One was the international program of KAIROS has always been secondary for the bishops' conference, they said. And the second explanation was the bishops' conference is not convinced that a campaign such as this, to push the government to change its mind, that is, will result in success. Now, in further explaining this second argument, the memo went on to report that the bishops expect the federal government to soon announce even more cutbacks to other programs in order to rebalance federal spending, they said. So, and I quote, the CCCB will want to focus especially on those which will have the greatest negative impact on the most vulnerable in our society. I look forward to it. But contrast this response with that of South African Bishop Desmond Tutu, who stated on December the 9th of last year, the world needs more of KAIROS Canada. It would be an unparalleled setback, he said, for the poor, vulnerable, and disenfranchised if the voice and work of KAIROS in the global south is muted. I know, because a group contacted me from Atlantic Canada, that they tried to organize to talk to the federal government about their disagreement with the cuts to KAIROS. They went to their bishop and they asked him to participate in this as well because they were church people. And he said, well, he didn't really think that he could do that because he'd received a memo from the bishop's office suggesting all these reasons why the bishops weren't going to do that. So these things do have an effect. I think the group went ahead, but without that support. What happens when church leaders do speak out? It's not always easy for them to do that. But I remember early in 2009, and you may have too if you've seen it, the Catholic bishop in St. Paul, Alberta, issued what I thought was a brilliant pastoral letter about the development of the Alberta tar sands that are located in his diocese. Bishop Luc Bouchard described the church's social teaching on the environment. He referenced 8 foundational Catholic theological principles supporting environmental ethics. He referred to over 40 pastoral letters that have been written on ecological issues by bishops around the world. He quoted the Vatican's compendium on the social doctrine of the church. He quoted the Catholic bishops' 2 pastoral letters on the environment to make his argument. And then he summarized what the environmental and social costs of development of the oil sands in his diocese were by saying, I'm forced to conclude that the integrity of the creation in the Athabasca oil sands is clearly being sacrificed for economic gain. The proposed future development of the oil sands constitutes a serious moral problem. The present pace and the scale of development in the Athabasca oil sands cannot be morally justified. What really amazed me was the response to the bishop in the media. Some of the negative commentary really lacked graciousness. From Calgary, someone wrote, if God was so concerned about the environment, then why is he naturally leaking all of the oil out of the banks into the Athabasca River? From Edmonton, tell the bishop to mind his own business. He should focus on making the church relevant again rather than trying to make government policy. There was an opinion piece in the Vancouver Sun that read, kindly tell Bishop Bouchard that I will stay out of his God business if he stays out of my oil sands business. Yet another reader opined that the bishop should worry about the pedophiles in the church's ranks instead of the oil sands. And another wag stated, this is the best one, yes, he's entitled to his opinion, point taken, now get back to church, eh? These types of postures show, I think, that not every commentator bothered to read the bishop's careful letter, but also there's a bit of a misunderstanding. Perhaps some of it is, we have to take it seriously. There's some of it earned on our part. But maybe there's a misunderstanding about what good religious practice in the social and political sphere actually is. And I think when the leadership of the churches doesn't get our message to the pews, And when the pews don't get their message to the leadership, there's bound to be a vacuum. Both need to play a role to see that public justice is quite integral to lives of faith. And I want to go on to talk about some of the things that I think we might actually do to make this message come through a little stronger. I want to try to suggest some things we can do and just not decry a situation, because I think we can move forward here. What I really believed is, even if the institutional churches have lost some of their ability and perhaps in some cases even their willingness to engage and motivate people, I believe there is still a role to play in defending this ecumenical social justice ministry in the churches. I personally see no reason why we would cede any ground around the situation of KAIROS, for example. Those are groups that for over 40 years our predecessors built up this important work together in ecumenical work, and I see no reason not to defend that. But I remember working at the Bishops' Conference and often yearning to get the attention of those groups that could make really creative nuisances of themselves by challenging those of us that were working in the institutions. If there's not a movement to encourage and to ask and to request and to foment these kinds of works of looking at the causes of problems to the ecology or social justice on any issue, it's going to be less authentic. It has to be there. It can't just come from the top, of course. But at the same time, if it's not happening, we can't spend all our time worrying about those church structures for social ministry if we just can't move them. And so we have to really emphasize putting our energy into those places where we can make a difference when the voice of people of faith has to be heard. I want to also say at a second point that it looks like lay people should really have to lead the way and take the bit to lead the way for ecumenical social justice ministry in the Canadian churches. We may have to start new movements whenever and however possible. We should get over any kind of assumption that the church's social witness has to be further clericalized in order to be of value. The churches now have people, well-educated people, and I'd even say as saintly people, who are sitting in the pews as are standing in the pulpits. Lay people of all sexes should be able to reclaim their social mission as well as their own contribution to the church's more inclusive voice if we really want to move the public justice agenda forward. And thirdly, many of you may have heard that the church's social teachings have been described as our best kept secret. And I think a reason for that is because we've designed the process of preparing these statements, particularly in that way. I think we've been successful. Think about it. How often has your church asked your opinion about taking a stance on any particular issue? It's perhaps even more unlikely if you've ever been asked to study and debate a question with your church leadership. Now, some of the churches don't have that same issue, but some do. I mean, some churches take positions in synods and general assemblies and so on, but others don't. The point is, if we don't invite more people to be part of these inclusive and deliberative processes where you arrive at what we want to say publicly, you can't really expect people then to show ownership and be responsible for these particular stances that happen later on. Fourthly, I think we have to walk the talk before we squawk. And the example of the 1996 letter is, I use that because maybe it's an example that points out some of the things that we want to do in the issue of poverty. Here is a statement on a burning issue of the day. It was released with people, only those people who can be the architects of their own liberation, those people that had a lived experience of poverty. And so they were being supported by the leadership. The media was brought in by the leadership. The event was facilitated by the leadership making a statement, but they got a chance to give their lived experience and to speak their words too. And without that kind of development, and then actually pronouncing of these kinds of messages, I think the message becomes rather less authentic and rather less credible. Many of us would agree that the best homily we've ever heard is one that we actually saw. Fifth, it's really important to assure that the spoken word of the churches, as in the case of, say, Archbishop Romero would have said, this spoken word of the churches is designed and delivered to defend the poor and the vulnerable. It's crucial, and it's not always easy, to ensure that the words don't arise in order to promote a particular church's interests and its reputation. And sixth, any pronouncement has to be delivered, I think, especially today, with appropriate humility. You can see in the polls that only, some 77% of Canadians still would say that they're Christian. But you can also see that 17% of those polled would have gone to a house of worship in the preceding week. This leads some to say that Canada is a nation of believers, but not belongers. So there's little use in fooling ourselves into thinking that a Christendom view of the world is still prevalent. A whole new role, maybe perhaps a smaller role, for organized Christian religions may be emerging in this post-white Christian churches that are going to exist not only in Canada, but also all over the world. I've now found myself working in an organization that attempts to work from a Christian base of values, but it doesn't get institutional funding from government or the churches itself. We have to struggle to find funding and then struggle to figure out a way to address complex social issues while maintaining an ecumenical outlook, a broad outlook. It's perhaps a little bit easier for us. We don't have to accept the formal stance of any church body on any issue without all kinds of debate, dialogue, and discussion. Hopefully, this will help us move the agenda forward. And maybe the situation that we're living presents us with some other possibilities. Lay associations have to be more collaborative and helpful to the churches that are desirable of recovering their voice in public justice issues. And perhaps we need to remind ourselves that maybe our large and unwieldy institutions don't always have the genetic makeup to be prophetic. Maybe there are several ways that we can speak. The cutting edge does seem to flourish more easily on the margins, in the smaller groupings that are more nimble, responsive, and that enjoy fewer organizational constraints. So just perhaps the Christian voice in public affairs today could be presented in new tones, but except, I would say, being neither muted nor maligned. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Joe. We have about 15 minutes for questions. If you have a question, I would ask that you go to either side of the room. We have microphones set up. Speak clearly into the microphone, and please try to keep your questions short and to the point so we can get as many in as possible. Diane.
Yeah, hi. Really glad to hear you speak, Joe, and I'm certainly glad you highlighted Bishop Luc Bouchard, amongst other things, in the ecumenical slant. And, okay, it's going to be, if I could just get two very quick anecdotes, I'll try to keep it short. Like, I keep thinking about how the CCCB has been so restructured that it's not the CCCB that when you were there, that's for sure. But I did, at one point, meet if you could call him your successor, like Francois is an advisor, he wasn't a director like you are, and he's doing his darndest. But I know at one meeting last November, it was actually at a meeting of a Social Affairs Commission in Ontario, bishops. We happened to talk about some national issues, and he happened to say, well, you know, there's one strange thing with our current government right now, and that is that we can send them a letter or a memo about something, and you won't hear a single thing from them, not a response. And I thought, yep, because if I think about what's going on locally with, well, even with things like the KAIROS, good people here trying to protest about KAIROS. And then I think about, on the other hand, where, because I know myself, as I was telling you before, and a Jesuit, like before in the Social Awareness Office in Ignatius Farm, will be going up to another part of the diocese to hear farmers out about the farm crisis, which is literally forcing them off the land, and it's something that's not getting the... We are going to probably work ecumenically, and I know myself, I'm going to squawk about what, you know, after I hear the pain. This is a process that's going to take several months. And I know our bishops and the Ontario bishops are interested in this issue. But because of that, well, the problems that you outlined so well, I don't know how far it's going to go. But I know there's one thing that amazes me, and this is what I want to have a response to. Even despite the cutbacks of the CCCB or the gutting of the ecumenical networks like KAIROS, I still hear people eager to say the churches have an impact, they can get the word out. They keep saying that to me, get the churches to speak. I'm certainly the lay aspect is what I support, but I want more of that comments because there's still the hope that churches can speak. Mm-hmm. I know they think clerical, but
yeah.
Anyhow.
Well, you're absolutely right. It seems to me that as long as we have churches with biblical response and with the social teaching of so many of the churches, we will have the churches speaking in one way or another. I think what we've lost a little bit is the organizational coherency at a national level. A thesis that I always had while working at the CCCB was I'd work a lot with our confreres in the United States, for example. And I found it interesting that the positioning of the bishops in Canada, in the Catholic Church in Canada, was I always felt more advanced, more progressive, if you will, or a little further ahead than positions of the American Church. I just, well, why would that be? Why would that be? So I'll give you a little example. In 2001, the Catholic bishops in Canada spoke publicly 3 times to encourage the Chrétien government to sign the Kyoto Accord on climate change. The American bishops put out a pastoral letter at the same time when Mr. Bush came to power, and it was, the title of it was Climate Change, a Call to Prudence. Now, so here's a little example. It's very interesting, why would bishops doing a reflection in one country come up with a different take than bishops in another country? In Canada, I think there are 2 reasons for it. The presence of the bishops of Quebec and all of the turmoil and so on that happened in Quebec of moving from a very Catholic society to a more secular society, if you will. Big factor we could talk a lot about. But the second thing was the history in Canada of working together among all the Christian faiths since the 1960s. We've inherited a great treasure. And so it turns, by the late 90s, that the Catholic Church in Canada, through the Bishops' Conference, actually joins the Canadian Council of Churches, which doesn't happen in the United States. And so that ecumenical thing is a treasure. People in the United Church were working on climate change issues 15 years before we Catholics really were, but they helpfully brought us along. Not everybody, but before the leadership really was, you know? So that's why if you hear the message that this ecumenical collaboration that we've had for many years is important, I think it is because it challenges us to move on, and these relationships are worth preserving.
Hi, I'm just going to raise this up a little bit because I'm a taller gentleman, I guess. I just want to ask this question, and it's based on 2 particular things in your talk. First of all, you mentioned that the sort of the decline in funding and sort of support for church-based groups, so church-based social justice groups like KAIROS, might be in part due to a growth in the more secular side, so non-church related, but still social justice oriented groups. And secondly, you were in Nicaragua for 7 years, and I know that particular society, in that particular society, the church has a completely different role and is the vehicle for social justice. So what I'd like to know is why, if social justice is the goal, why a Christian group to accomplish that goal? So basically, why, if the work is being done, what's so great about it being a Catholic or a Christian particular group? I'd just like to hear your point of view on that.
Thank you. Interesting question, eh? I was in, am I allowed to talk about the competition? I was at the University of Western Ontario yesterday with some students. Kings, yeah, in particular. And it was interesting. One of the students mentioned that they were in at King's, which is a Catholic college, and they were in conversations about doing just peace work. And this student said that as soon as the instructor raises the question of doing just peace work from a religious background, you can see all the lights turn off in the students in the room. Now, I find that amazing. So your question is, well, why, if this work can be done by groups in secular society, if we can defend the environment through membership in Greenpeace, if we can do development work through Oxfam, why have development and peace, and why have church groups doing it, is a really key kind of concern. The only way I can answer that, and I have 17-year-old twins. I find I can't answer it for them. But they're struggling with those kinds of things right now. I don't know about that next generation. But for me, it's impossible to be a person of faith unless I'm concerned about those things. And I can walk and chew gum. I can give money to an Oxfam, or I can participate in a campaign on ecology things, but I also want to know from my faith how it speaks to ecology. So I'm really pleased that in our church we bring those things into the liturgy, and that at certain times of the year we pray at the prayers of the faithful for species going extinct. A lot of people didn't understand that. What's that about? You have to explain it to the kids because they don't know what's going on. But you know what? If it happens in the liturgy, it all of a sudden becomes important. And why do we do that? Because here's God's creation being affected by the way we're living. And it makes sense to people to say, if our parking lot outside that church looks just like the parking lot outside Walmart 2 hours later, what are we really about here? Aren't we really about, as people of faith, putting forward some values that are quite different to society? So when you live in a place like in Nicaragua or any places that you might be in other parts of the world where those struggles really come from people's faith belief, we've lost a little bit of that sense of urgency here. What I think it comes down to are really two questions, for me anyway. The one is, and I think young people ask this in a lot more of a deep and radical way than maybe people at my age. But the two questions are, what am I going to say yes to with my life? And the other question is, what am I going to say no to with my life? You decide those questions, and you come to those by your deepest values. So in my generation, I was 21 and I was offered work in a church-based organization, and I could see that this made sense. I wish I could say we were making all those opportunities available for people in this generation.
I believe over here was first. Yes.
Thanks for your interesting talk and the way you really backed it up with your life experience. I'm wondering if you see that this decline in the institutional nature of social justice work, do you think that's lagging or leading the general movement in society towards like distrusting large institutions and doing that in favor of more nimble networking and things like that? Good question again. There's a whole
debate. In the organization I work in, I'm the oldest person by 20 years. Everybody else has hair, they're good looking, all this other kind of stuff. But it's interesting, so a lot of the work that people want to do, when I worked in Make Poverty History, for example, internet-based campaigns, getting people like Bono and Steve Nash and other people on board talking about poverty in Africa can grab a whole wide range of people. The next step is, how do you make that go deeper, eh? And that's where there's a certain level of a lot of the campaigning, the internet campaign that we talk about at work, social media, getting people involved in Flickr and all these kind of Facebook. We have fans on our Facebook page. All these kinds of things, it's a different way of operating. It's not as institutionalized. You can do it from home. But you know what? A lot of those internet campaigns and so on don't go as deep as we need to go to make real change. When you look at the issues, if we really want to be present to people that are suffering with poverty, we can't do it all on the internet. We have to actually be present with them. If we really want to do something about the ecology, we really have to use the tools of new media and all these other kinds of things, but we really have to change the way we live, and we have to change the way government acts. So it's a good point you raise. We're going to have to do things in new ways, and so on and so forth. And a lot of we're going through a time when some of the institutions of society are just going to be much slower in getting there. Yeah, good observation.
Joe, I have a couple of points I'd like to make, and I'd like your response to them. The first one is, I have a letter here with me signed by all the leaders of all the churches to Prime Minister Harper, asking for a meeting. I'm sure you've read the letter.
Yeah.
I'm sure you're familiar with the contents. Yeah. As far as I know at this point in time, he has not responded to these people. Our Member of Parliament in Guelph, Frank Valerian, is pursuing this as a strong Christian, saying that you need to respond to these leaders. Either you're going to meet with them or you're not, to put the issue right on the table and give us the real reasons why KAIROS is not being funded. And I think most of us know the real reasons has to do with the critical misalignment of KAIROS with the policies of the Conservative government, especially around the tar sands and climate change. That's one point. The other is, there is hope beyond the lack of response of the government to this type of invitation to meet. There is hope. And the hope I see is our group called the Elderberry Connection are having our 6th annual retreat at Ignatius at Loyola House in April. And part of our retreat, we have young people coming. It's called the Youth Forum. And it's on climate justice. And that comes from KAIROS too. And the people that will be on that forum are young people. They're from the University of Guelph and other universities, and they will be in Copenhagen. And they will be addressing global south and global north issues around climate justice, Copenhagen and beyond, tar sands and indigenous rights, economy and environment, and the fact that they want to be heard and they weren't heard in Copenhagen. So that is a sign of hope for me, and I just want to share it with you. So to let you know that our group, the Elderberry Connection, is making them part of our retreat weekend with our resource person from the Green Mountain Monastery in Vermont, Sister Gail Rossello. And all of us will be doing some reflection on that weekend and then listening to the young people. So maybe we should invite Stephen Harper to come too, should we?
That was the question. Should Stephen Harper come?
Just let me say that, is your retreat this weekend or the next? Oh, in April, okay. The 27th of March, Earth Hour. So Earth Hour started, you might have heard about it, it started in Sydney, Australia in 2008, I think. Could be 7 or 8. And turning off the lights for an hour and reflecting on what this, saving, what was the carbon saving and so on and so on and so on. What we've done in my house for the last 2 years and what we'll do this year is we'll actually not only turn out the lights, but we'll have a little prayer service. And we'll have a prayer service that helps us reflect on, with about 14 friends, reflect on, the religious call to environmental justice and what that means. We'll also reflect on the fact that it's the 27th is just a couple of days after this anniversary of the 30th anniversary of the death of Archbishop Romero in El Salvador and what that means. So melding the social justice with ecological justice and thinking about those things together. That's kind of what other people around the world will be, believe in 80 some odd countries, will be doing Earth Hour. You have Coca-Cola supporting Earth Hour now, helping the World Wildlife Fund put up the website. Lots of people can do it, that's fine. But what people of faith can bring to the discussion is all our kinds of values and hopefully allow that to help us go deeper into the change that we need. So KAIROS actually has a campaign for that as well.
It always amazes me when you hear the words elimination of poverty and the eradication of poverty, which is an impossibility. Even Jesus said, the poor you will always have with you. So I'm surprised they don't use the word reducing poverty or something like that. Because when you have, there's so many situations that it makes it difficult. For example, I know a high school in Brantford, 25% of the kids are playing the government on welfare roll. Because this way they don't have to get home, they can do their own thing, they live in in apartments, and they're getting pregnant, and they drop out of school, and this goes on and on and on. And there's so many other countries that have all these dictatorships. So it will always be a continuing problem. But while we look at it in Iraq, how they spent trillions of dollars trying to set up a system, and then when the Americans pull out, it'll probably go back to where it was.
Well, we had quite a bit of debate around whether you actually talk about poverty reduction or poverty elimination and so on, and we've chosen very carefully those words, all of the movements of people that work there. I think that you can also find Bible quotes that say that in the Acts of the Apostles about how we actually would treat one another and how everybody would share. You can find in Deuteronomy also quotes about how there shall be no poor among you. So we have to use those as directions for us to go forward with the same idea. The campaign information that we've left out for our organization and the hall, you're welcome to look at. We're actually asking 6 of the provinces in Canada, including Ontario, by the way, now have poverty reduction strategies. Several governments around the world, Britain, Ireland, have poverty reduction strategies. We have none. We have a parliamentary committee studying this right now. We want to push that this actually gets done and that the federal government actually has programs that do help reduce poverty, of course, and they could do a lot more. So please take a look at that information, if you will, at your leisure and support it if you feel you can.
One more quick one.
Uh-oh. You always get afraid when the guy in the front row gets up, eh?
And a Presbyterian at that.
Yeah.
I'm going to tell the truth, Joe. Thank you very much for your talk. It's a serious question. The work that your organization does in Ottawa, you're close to the Hill, so you're meeting with MPs and senators, and we're at a new moment in this country. I mean, we have a minority government that governs with I think, the mistakes aside, with a fair amount of confidence. And it governs as if it's in a majority. So your organization, meeting with MPs, what kind of reaction are you getting from members of all parties in terms of the gospel message that you bring about the fact that we can reduce and we can eliminate poverty in this country? What kind of reaction are you getting at this moment?
Thank you. So could I just say that if you don't know Stephen Allen, he serves the Presbyterian Church in Canada, and I think he's Associate Secretary for Social Justice Issues, something like that. And he sits on the board of KAIROS, if you want to talk to him later on. And he'll tell you the truth, as he said. But the impact we're having, this campaign we've started is called Dignity for All. We actually have worked on it in my organization, Citizens for Public Justice, with what used to be called the National Anti-Poverty Organization, which is now called Canada Without Poverty. So working with people who have lived experience of poverty so they have voice in this. We launched it 8 months ago in Calgary at the Canadian Social Forum. You can sign up in support of it on the website. So 5,000 people have done that already. 300 and some odd organizations, including some parishes and different faith groups have done that, lots of religious orders. The Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops, the Anglican Church, a number of churches of the United Church have supported this. KAIROS have supported the campaign. We have, your question, Stephen, was about MPs and so on. We have 43 MPs that have signed up from all parties, very few from the Conservative Party. That's what happens in these kinds of things. The party in power, a little hesitant always to do so. But we've had some really good successes on getting parliamentarians to be interested in this kind of thing. We had a lovely event on February 1st, which we called we were going to call it a dinner for dignity, but we had to keep canceling it because these politicians were never around and they kept proroguing and so on. We had to find out. So we finally did this event in the Presbyterian Church right across from the Supreme Court, and we didn't know how many MPs would show up. We thought there'd be a half dozen. We'd get a few from 2 minutes from every one of them in each and every party who are in this committee, the HUMA committee that's working on poverty issues. 27 politicians. We had tables of people living in poverty talking to an MP, and then folks like ourselves were there to just kind of direct traffic. It was a lovely exchange that I think everybody, one MP wrote us later and said, newly elected, and she said, it was a marvelous evening, the best experience I've had as an MP to date. So what happens with the governing party, it's very hard. If you're in cabinet, it's hard to get through to them because they have cabinet solidarity. They won't go against it. But I've met with personally with 2 of the 3 MPs in this town and several others. They haven't supported our campaign yet, but they at least give you a hearing. And I think when you can come to them with the basis of less of a political agenda, but more of we want to share a values agenda here, and we can speak to you as people of faith, and you can respond in this kind of way. Hopefully, we can move this issue forward. So I think there is some. I want to give an optimistic slant to that.
Thanks, Joe. So to help bring this evening to a close, I would like to invite St. Jerome's president, Dr. David Perrin, to say a few final words.
Thanks very much, Scott, and indeed what a very pleasurable evening this has been for all of us. And I'd like to acknowledge and welcome in a special way, just prior to the lecture tonight, we had a very lovely reception organized by our University Advancement Officer, Nadine Collins, who's sitting at the back. Nadine, could you just stand up? We'll give a hand of applause here. It was a very lovely reception for our donors, those that support us here at St. Jerome's University in so many different ways, and who came to the lecture this evening. So I'd have a second opportunity to thank you for participating in the conference tonight, for your support of St. Jerome's, and certainly for your coming to the reception earlier. So thank you very much for all of that. It is indeed my pleasure to thank Joe Gunn on behalf of all of us here tonight and on behalf of St. Jerome's University and the Catholic Register, sponsors of the lecture this evening. Joe and I, for the last number of years, have been working together at the Galilee Retreat Center in Arnprior. Joe has very generously, for the last while, been on our board of directors, and what a pleasure it has, Joe, to be working together in that effort. Again, another example of how Joe is very generous with his time, with his talents, and the multiple areas where you use those and reach out into the range of communities across Canada, literally, and contribute in so many different ways. So from a personal experience working with you, I express my gratitude and my thanks for your presence here tonight. Tonight we've heard from somebody that has really reflected on issues dear to his heart, that lives those values very, very close to the ground. Anti-poverty issues, justice issues, they're all issues close to our heart here at St. Jerome's University. They're very, very dear to our students, our faculty, and our staff, and what a pleasure it was to be part of the reflection this evening. Joe, you've helped us understand that the voices of the just come from all venues and all characters, and we need to depend on that. We need to be surprised from where those voices come and be ready to receive their message when they come, and not slight them or diminish them in any way. You've helped us understand that the causes of anti-poverty and justice is not just the work of bishops, and perhaps not even primarily so. It's not the work just for not-for-profits, and perhaps not primarily so. But it's the work of all of us gathered here tonight, and those with whom we work, those with whom we live, and those we love. Joe has described the cause of justice as a personal vocation, and I can witness personally to that truth. A personal call to something more in life. And if anybody has worked for a diocese or a religious order or the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops, we certainly know that it's not for financial reasons. That will not be the incentive. Joe's first-hand experience in South America for 7 years solidified the vocation that was already integral to his life from his very earliest days, from his youth. And I would like to just say a word of the young people in our group this evening, that these things take on a life of their own, and I hope too that you are surprised by where your values and your sensitivity for justice will lead you in the years to come, particularly students in our Beyond Borders program. The question that came to my mind as Joe was speaking tonight, are the issues of justice tired in the churches? Have we become tired of the issues that ought to be core and central to our lives? Are they tired in our government systems, in our civil jurisdictions, and other areas of municipal responsibility? We cannot allow this to happen, and that is the key message that I heard from Joe this evening. Not allowing it to happen will depend on the formation of partnerships that are key, partnerships that call us to work together with all people of God's will and of goodwill. This is the hope of which you spoke tonight, Joe. Moving the public justice agenda ahead and forward. Public justice agenda that cannot move ahead without our participation requires a lot of personal involvement from a lot of people. And that's you, and that's I. So, Joe, I'd like to thank you for this personal invitation to move again along this pathway. I thank you for walking that path personally before us. Thank you.
So a few more final matters on your way out. If you want to receive updates on center events, lectures and so on, there's a sign-up sheet outside for email. So if you want to be on our email list, sign up there. We will not see you again until September. And until we see you then, I hope we see you on many other occasions, but until we see you again in this forum, God bless. Take care.